Good morning. Coming to you again a little bit early this morning. Tomorrow will be normal time, 9 o'clock worship at Mabel and Sutton. You're welcome to join us for worship on the 5th Sunday of August, which is tomorrow morning. But today we look at 1 Corinthians 10, verses 1 through 18. And Paul is reminding people to remember history. You know, we learn from history, and we can't change history. History is fact. It's already happened. It's done, and we should learn a lot from history. We should remember, and in order to remember, we need to know our history. And so Paul is reminding the people of this day, and today, of warnings from history. And he says, I don't want you to be unaware that our ancestors were all under the cloud. You know, they were all slaves in Egypt. This is what he's referring to. And they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses. You know, God had sent Moses to them. They passed through the waters of the Red Sea. You know, God was setting them free. God was leading them. And yet the reminder that Paul wants them to know is that even though God set them free from captivity, even though he led them through the Red Sea, even though he gave them manna in the wilderness and quail in the wilderness and water from the rock, and he took care of them in all of their needs, what happened when Moses went up on the mountain? Well, they built this bronze idol or this gold idol, and they fell away from God. They forgot about God. So he's saying, remember that God is faithful. Remember that this God who led the people out of Egypt got upset with these people who he led because of their unfaithfulness, and not a one of that first generation that left from the slavery of Egyptians made it into the promised land. Remember that piece of history. Remember, because of the history, that God is faithful, that God has continued to send prophets, that God has continued day after day, year after year, generation after generation, being patient, being kind, being loving, being understanding, and yet knowing who the people are. So he's saying, remember, God is faithful, you be faithful. You know, don't give up on God. You know, it's just, he said, you know, in verse 5, nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Yeah, and they perished and were scattered in the wilderness. This first generation, they died as they were wandering in the wilderness. Or, you know, they weren't maybe just wandering every day, but, you know, they were not in the promised land. And they perished, and they didn't find their home, this promised land of God. You know, God was not pleased with them. Why? Because they forgot who God was. They worshiped other gods. They worshiped false idols. They turned away from this God who led them out of captivity. Verse 6, Paul says, these things occurred as examples for us, so that we may not desire evil as they did. And I think about, you know, what's been going on in our nation with the destruction of statues, with the saying that, you know, that we can't honor this person because of who he was in this situation that he was, you know, a slave owner, whatever he may have been, you know, in our Revolutionary War and our early histories. But we need to remember that, you know, people of all nationalities were slave owners. People of all nationalities were slaves. I mean, but we need to learn and remember our history. And we need to learn and remember and know the history of the world, of you know, communism, of Nazi Germany, of all of the suppression of everything that goes on. We need to remember those things so the same things don't happen to us. And this is what Paul is saying. These things have occurred so that we can learn. You know, and I'm talking about faith, and I'm talking about our lives. I'm talking about our freedoms. I'm talking about everything that's going on in the world. We need to remember. We need to remember so that we don't make the same mistakes again. You know, if you hit your thumb or your finger with a hammer one time, you really don't just do it again just for fun, do you? No. And It's one of those things we learn from our mistakes, and we should learn from the mistakes of previous generations. And this is what Paul is reminding these people of Corinth, that, God is faithful. Don't you be unfaithful. He says, do not become idolaters as some of them did. I mean, this is what, stay faithful to God. Stay faithful to Jesus. Keep your trust in Jesus, the one and only Lord and Savior. Paul says, don't become idolaters as some of them. The people sat down to eat and drink, and they rose up to play. I mean, it's an old story. A fellow pastor told me of a person who had been very active in the church, a president of the church council, and a businessman who was regarded as a good part of the economy, and was sent to prison for embezzling, for being a crook. And his words were that, I forgot to put Sunday morning together with the rest of the week. You can't worship God on Sunday morning or on Saturday night or whatever day you worship, and then live the rest of your week, live the rest of your life totally forgetting about God and putting everything else first. You just don't do that. You got to keep God in the forefront. You got to live each day knowing that God is God and that Jesus is your Savior. You don't sit down to eat and drink. You don't come to the communion table and say, boy, no, I'm clean, I'm forgiven, I can go right back at it again. No, we don't do it that way. And so, we must not indulge in sexual immorality. We must not live in our sin. We must not, just bask in the luxury of sin. Well, wouldn't that be great? No. But we need to remember, I've got underlined verse 11. These things happened to them to serve as an example. They were written down to instruct us, on whom the ends of the age have come. And then he says this is another way. If you think you're standing, watch out that you do not fall. Don't get so sure of yourself that, I'm such a goody person, that all of a sudden, boom, He's saying, remember your history. Remember that we are all sinners. Remember that Jesus died for us. Remember these things, And in verse 13 he says, no testing has overtaken you that is not common to everyone. And God is faithful. Sometimes we look at ourselves or somebody else and say, man, they sure have a lot on their plate. And granted, people do. But when you think about what more could happen than hasn't already happened in history. I mean, it's just, there are very few new things. I mean, there are new diseases that come out. There are new discoveries and stuff. But the reality is that, my life isn't really totally unique, because things I go through, others have gone through as well. And that is not common, that other people have gone through before. Remembering that God is faithful, and he says he will not let you be tested beyond your strength. And that's a hard verse. He won't let you be tested beyond your strength. But the reminder is that God isn't the one that's sending the troubles to us. God gives us strength to get through each and every day. And when we have troubles, in our lives, and when we have sickness in our lives, and when we have other things going on, we're more apt to seek God out and to pray and to ask God to intervene in our lives than when things are on a nice even keel and everything is, everything's coming up roses. I mean, it's great, and sometimes we forget to give God thanks for our blessings. But when we have troubles, we turn to God, and that's, I'm seeing reminders that this is the 20th anniversary of September 11th, 2001. And we need to remember that. And we need to remember that, in the weeks and months after that terrible, terrible tragedy that struck our nation and the world, people turned out to worship. People turned more to God than they had for a long time. They were remembering that this God is a God of love and grace and hope and comfort. And this is a reminder that We need that Paul has given to remember our history, to learn from our history, so we don't let those same things happen again. And it's true in our lives of faith, as well as our daily lives. I mean, it's just like I said, you don't purposely hit your thumb with a hammer every day just because you feel so much better when you quit. We don't do that. We learn once you do something, you try not to do it again. You don't. And this is a reminder. Pay attention to history, know history, and know always that God is faithful.